Okay, so we're diving into some pretty heavy stuff today, folks. Bob Woodward's new book, War. And let me tell you, this thing is no joke.
You're not kidding. I mean, Woodward always delivers the goods, but this deep dive into Biden's foreign policy, it's got people talking, that's for sure.
Yeah, and for good reason. I
Yeah.
mean, where do you even start with this thing? I guess the biggest bombshell that jumped out at me right out of the gate was this whole thing about Putin and nuclear weapons.
Oh yeah, no, that's definitely a showstopper.
50%. A 50% chance that Putin might actually go nuclear. That's what Biden's own national security team is saying, according to Woodward. 50%. I mean, come on.
Yeah, and you know what's really striking is that previous estimates were way lower, more like 5%. So this is a huge jump.
A huge jump, which kind of makes you wonder, like, what do they know that we don't? You know what I mean?
Right, right, exactly. And I think it highlights this really unsettling truth, which is that assessing the risk of nuclear war, it's not just about counting missiles or looking at, satellite images. It's about trying to understand the psychology of a guy like Putin.
It's like, how do you predict the unpredictable?
Exactly. It's like trying to get inside the head of someone who holds that much power, someone who's willing to take these incredible risks. And that's where I think Woodward's reporting gets really interesting because he takes us inside those high stakes conversations between Biden and Putin.
Yeah, and these aren't your typical diplomatic phone calls, right? I mean, this is serious business.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Woodward details this one video conference, I think it was back in December of 2021, and then there's this follow-up phone call, and, Biden lays it all out there. He's like, look, we see what you're doing in Ukraine. We have the intelligence, and this is not the way to go. But then, according to the book, Putin just turns around and starts talking about nuclear war.
Oh, wow.
Uh.
Like casually. What does that even sound like?
Yeah, it's chilling. And what's really interesting is how Biden responds. He doesn't flinch. He just lays it out there, makes it very clear that a nuclear war is unwinnable for anyone, that the devastation would be global. And he even uses this phrase. He talks about Russia facing global isolation.
Global isolation. Okay, now, I'm not a foreign policy expert, but that sounds pretty intense. What does it even mean?
Ah.
It's like more than just a timeout from the UN or something, right?
Oh, yeah. We're talking like crippling sanctions, potential expulsion from international organizations, basically Russia becoming a pariah state. Like, nobody wants to do business with you. You're cut off from the rest of the world.
So it's like the ultimate economic and political pressure.
Yeah, and it just shows you the stakes of this whole situation, right? I mean, we're talking about the potential end of the world as we know it.
And all of this is happening, by the way, while Biden's still trying to deal with the fallout from Afghanistan.
Right, right. And that's the other thing that Woodward does so well in this book is he shows how the ghost of that withdrawal, as he puts it, just hangs over everything.
Yeah, I mean, you don't have to be a foreign policy expert or, a historian to understand why that situation continues to haunt Biden.
No, not at all. And I think, a big part of it is that it raised all these questions about American competence on the world stage. Like, can the U.S. be trusted? Can they deliver on their promises? Allies are left wondering, can we really rely on these guys? And then on the other side of the coin, you have adversaries like Putin, who may see an opportunity, sign of weakness.
So it's like Biden's walking this tightrope.
Yeah.
Dealing with this massive crisis with Russia, with Putin potentially on the brink of, I don't know, doing something crazy. But he's also still trying to regain his footing, after Afghanistan.
Exactly, exactly. And that's where the story takes another kind of crazy turn. Because as if things weren't complicated enough with Putin, Woodward drops this bombshell about Trump's involvement, or I guess continued involvement, you could say, in U.S.-Russia relations.
Wait, what? Trump? But he's not even, he's not in office anymore. What could he even be doing at this point to add to this whole, volatile situation?
Well, that's the thing, right? It's like, remember how we were talking about, like, the importance of personal relationships and all of this? And how those relationships, they don't necessarily just disappear when a president leaves office.
Okay, so what are you saying?
So Woodward, he reveals that Trump had, get this, seven private phone calls with Vladimir Putin after leaving the White House. 7.
7? Are you serious? 7 secret calls? Like, what were they even talking about? And how does Biden even, that seems like it could totally undermine any efforts to present a united front against Russia.
Oh, absolutely. And the secrecy surrounding these calls, it just adds to the whole mystery of it all. Like, Woodward talks about how Trump would insist on talking to Putin alone, even asking his own aides to leave the room.
Wow. Okay, yeah, that definitely raises some eyebrows. What could be so important that you couldn't even, have your own staff in the room.
Right. It's this huge question mark hanging over everything, right? Like Biden's entire foreign policy agenda, and then you throw this into the mix. Like, what is going on here? And then there's this detail about COVID testing equipment.
Wait, what? Hold on, hold on. COVID testing equipment. What does that have to do with anything?
I know, right? It's one of those details where you're just like, wait, what? But yeah, Woodward reports that Trump sent some of this equipment, COVID testing equipment, to Russia during the pandemic. And it's not entirely clear why.
Okay, that's just strange. I don't even know what to say to that. So, okay, let me try to get this straight. So on the one hand, you've got Biden, right? He's all about direct engagement, trying to deter Putin, using a combination of diplomacy and, the threat of this global isolation thing. And then on the other hand, you've got Trump kind of operating in the shadows, maintaining these back channels, having these secret conversations. And it seems like he's driven by, I don't know, his own personal connections, his own motivations, which may or may not align with, U.S. foreign policy objectives.
Yeah, it's a stark contrast, isn't it? And it's not just their approach to Putin that's different. It's also how they deal with other world leaders. Like, take Benjamin Netanyahu, for example.
Oh, right, right. Yeah, the book mentions some tension there.
Tension? Might be putting it lightly, actually. Woodward describes the relationship between Biden and Netanyahu as, like, strained, fraught with disagreement. And a lot of it seems to be coming from Biden's side. Like, he's angry. Woodward even recounts an instance where Biden's expressing anger over some of Netanyahu's military tactics, specifically the ones used against Hamas in Gaza.
Wow. Okay, yeah, that's definitely not the kind of language you usually hear in diplomatic circles. It sounds like, you can just feel the frustration there.
Yeah.
For those of us who might not be as familiar with the whole, the intricacies of this relationship, what's at the root of all this?
Well, I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier about the whole Afghanistan withdrawal and how that kind of raised doubts about America's power and reliability, on the global stage. And Netanyahu, he's someone who's always relied on a strong U.S. presence in the Middle East as a deterrent, for their adversaries, but also as a guarantee of their own security. But with Biden pulling back, shifting focus towards Russia and China, Netanyahu's probably feeling a little isolated, a little vulnerable, and maybe even a little betrayed, you could say.
So it's not just a personality clash. It's about, fundamentally different views on the role of the United States in the world.
Exactly. And you see this difference of opinion playing out in their approach to, well, pretty much everything, right? I mean, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Iran, even domestic issues like the Israeli judicial reforms.
Okay, so just to recap here, we've got Putin, who may or may not be on the verge of, starting a nuclear war. We've got this strained, fragile relationship between the U.S. and Israel. And all of this is happening while a former president, the former president, is out there having these secret phone calls with Putin. Is there anything else we need to throw into this mix before we try to unpack it all?
Well, we can't forget about the pressure that Biden's facing from within his own administration. I mean, Woodward doesn't just focus on the external challenges. He also kind of peels back the curtain on the internal disagreements, within Biden's own national security team, especially when it comes to dealing with Russia.
Oh, right. Like everyone's on the same page all the time.
Yeah, no, not exactly. It's like, imagine trying to conduct an orchestra, but everyone's playing a different tune.
A very chaotic orchestra in this case. Yeah. You got that right. So you've got some advisors who are urging caution, right? Emphasizing diplomacy, de-escalation, all that. And then you've got others who are like, no, we need to be more forceful, more military aid to Ukraine, tougher sanctions, the whole 9 yards.
So it's like Biden's trying to manage this incredibly high-stakes poker game with Putin. Meanwhile, he's trying to smooth things over with Israel. And on top of all that, he's got to wrangle his own team. And, oh, yeah, did we mention the former president is out there having private chats with Putin? It's a lot.
It's a lot to process. And, it really makes you wonder, what does Woodward himself think about all this? I mean, what's the takeaway here?
Yeah, what's the point of pulling back the curtain if you're not going to, at least give us a hint about what's going on backstage? Well, and this is where it gets tricky, right? Because Woodward, he's a journalist, not a political commentator. He's not in the business of offering up solutions or, taking sides. But I think what makes war so fascinating, so insightful, is the way it just lays bare that raw human element of global politics. You know what I mean?
I think so, but break it down for me.
Okay, so we often think about these things, right? International relations, we think about it in these very abstract terms, like treaties, strategic interests, economic alliances, blah, blah, blah. But what Woodward does, he reminds us that at the heart of all of this, it's human beings with
Well,
all their flaws and their egos and their personal baggage, and they're making decisions that have global consequences.
so understanding those personal relationships, like the backroom deals, the things that are left unsaid, that's just as important as, reading the official statements and the policy papers and all that.
Absolutely. War is kind of like a cautionary tale when you think about it, about how, sometimes traditional diplomacy, it only gets you so far, and how these personal relationships, these personal connections, they can have this outsized influence on a world that's more interconnected, more volatile than ever.
Like that old saying, right? It's all about who you know.
Exactly. But in this case, it's not just who you know, it's how well you know them and what happens when those relationships go south. And that's something to keep in mind, not just when we're talking about Biden and Putin or Trump and Netanyahu, but in any situation where you have these powerful personalities interacting on the world stage.
Okay, so where do we go from here? What are we supposed to do with all of this information?
Well, I think for starters, it's a good reminder to stay informed.
Right.
Don't just read the headlines, dig a little deeper, try to understand the forces that are shaping our world, the seen and the unseen. And war, it gives us a glimpse into those unseen forces. And it reminds us that the future isn't just shaped by, policies and treaties. It's also shaped by personal ambitions and grudges and alliances,
Yeah.
by the things that happen behind closed doors.
So it's like a reminder to never underestimate the human element in any of this.
Exactly. Because in the end, global politics, it's still a very human story, for better or for worse. And that's a truth that war throws into sharp relief.
Well, that's a lot to unpack, but I think we've covered a lot of ground today, and it's definitely given me a lot to think about.
Me too. It's a reminder that even in a world dominated by technology, social media, globalization, all of that, those human connections, those conflicts, they still matter more than we might realize.
Thanks for diving deep on this one with me. It's been enlightening, to say the least.
Always a pleasure. Always happy to dive into these things with you.
And to all of you listening, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Bob Woodward's war. We hope it's given you some food for thought, maybe even a new way of looking at this crazy, complicated world we live in. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep seeking understanding, and as always, keep learning.